Back. Plot. The Walking Dead. Jump to summaries. 6. Synopsis 1. Summaries. Sheriff Deputy Rick Grimes wakes up from a coma to learn the world is in ruins and must lead a group of survivors to stay alive. Sheriff Deputy Rick Grimes gets shot and falls into a coma. When awoken, he finds himself in a zombie apocalypse. Not knowing what to do, he sets out to find his family. After he's done that, he gets connected to a group to become the leader. He takes charge and tries to help this group of people survive, find a place to live and get them food. This show is all about survival, the risks and the things you'll have to do to survive. Jerkle 1. Sheriff Deputy Rick Grimes gets shot in combat and awakens to a zombie apocalypse. He meets a group on the outskirts of Atlanta and, soon, becomes their leader. The walkers, what they call zombies, feed on the living, so they try to move to different and safer locations to survive. Rick Grimes was the sheriff at King County Police Office, until one day he and his partner Shane Walsh get a call about two men in a car with guns. During that call, Rick gets shot and goes into a coma. He wakes up to a world where the dead come back to life. Sheriff Deputy Rick Grimes has been shot. He falls into a coma and wakes up in a hospital, only to find that it is in ruins. He finds a group of survivors and adapts himself to the only survivors left in the city. Then little did he know he soon becomes known as the leader. Sheriff Deputy Rick Grimes has to get the small group he attached himself to safety, food and water. The only thing that stops them is the walkers, also known as zombies. One more. Synopsis. The Walking Dead, based on the comic book series written by Robert Kirkman and published by Image Comics, tells the story of the months and years that follow after a zombie apocalypse. It follows a group of survivors, led by police officer Rick Grimes, who travel in search of a safe and secure home. The comic goes on to explore the challenges of life in a world overrun by zombies, who take a toll on the survivors, and sometimes the interpersonal conflicts present a greater danger to their continuing survival than the zombies that roam the country. Over time, the characters are changed by the constant exposure to death, and some grow willing to do anything to survive.
Shane shoots Otis
Official
in the leg to
AM.
leave behind as a distraction for the walkers, so he can escape with the supplies. Shane lies to the others that Otis willingly sacrificed himself, and Herschel uses the supplies to save Carl's life. Meanwhile, the other survivors are beginning to make themselves feel at home on Herschel's farm. Herschel is hesitant to allow this large group of strangers to stay on his farm with his family, but reluctantly agrees if they follow his rules. Daryl begins to feel at home in this newfound family, and forms a tight friendship with Carol. Lori discovers that she is pregnant, but is unsure if the father was Rick or Shane, creating even more tension in the former best friend's relationship. Glenn develops a romance with Herschel's daughter Maggie, which they must keep a secret from her father. When Glenn discovers that Herschel kept a barn filled with walkers on his property, Herschel explains that they were all his family and he hoped he could save them all by finding a cure. While this upsets Rick, it sends the increasingly unhinged Shane into a rage, who opens the barn doors to let the walkers out. Shane and the rest of the group kill the walkers one by one, including the last walker to emerge from the barn, Sophia. Herschel is distraught over the events at his farm and retreats to a nearby town bar to drink. Rick and Glenn find him and convince him to stop drinking and return home, but they are then attacked by a group of violent strangers. As Rick, Herschel, and Glenn flee, one of the strangers, Randall, is injured. Not wanting to leave the man behind to be killed by walkers, Rick takes Randall back to the farm. Things quickly spiral into chaos over what to do with Randall. The strangers group was violent and would come looking for him, putting everyone at the farm in danger. But if they let Randall go, he could lead them back to the farm anyway. Shane is adamant that Randall needs to die, but the kind-hearted Dale tries to calm everyone down. When Dale is later killed by a walker, Rick is resolved to honor Dale's life by sparing Randall's. Unfortunately, Shane takes matters into his own hands, sneaking Randall off the farm to murder him in the woods. When Rick discovers this act, he confronts Shane. Shane then holds Rick at gunpoint, convinced his best friend couldn't make the tough decisions necessary to keep their group alive. Rick is forced to stab Shane, killing him. When Shane reanimates as a walker, the young Carl is forced to shoot him in the head to save Rick's life. The sound of the gunshot attracts a horde of walkers to the farm, and the survivors are forced to flee. Many of Herschel's family members are killed, but he and his daughters Maggie and Beth escape with Rick's group. During the chaos, Andrea is separated from the others, but saved from the horde of zombies by a mysterious hooded woman named Michonne, who wields a deadly katana. You know, the survivors of the zombie apocalypse are gonna need a lot of help in repopulating the earth, and luckily this video's sponsor, Adam and Eve, have the perfect fix. Adam and Eve is America's favorite adult store, and they've been in business for over 50 years. And in that time, they've satisfied over 20 million customers. They've got completely discreet shipping and a 90-day no-hassle return policy, plus 20% of their profit goes toward fighting the spread of HIV around the world. So head on over to adamandeve.com and use promo code RECAP for 50% off one item plus free shipping. Thanks again to Adam and Eve for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the recap. In Season 3 of The Walking Dead, 8 months have passed and Rick's group decide to set up their new home in an abandoned prison. While clearing the prison of walkers, Herschel is bitten on the foot, though after amputating it to stop the infection, his life is saved. When a prison alarm goes off, walkers begin to swarm, causing chaos within the prison walls. T-Dog sacrifices himself to save Carol, while Lori, Maggie, and Carl find themselves trapped in a boiler room right as Lori goes into labor. Maggie is forced to perform a C-section on Lori to deliver the baby, but Lori dies in the process. Carl is then forced to shoot his mother in the head to prevent her from reanimating as a walker. As the walkers are cleared out and the survivors regroup, Rick is devastated to learn of Lori's death and names their new daughter Judith. Another group of strangers, led by siblings Tyrese and Sasha, also discover the prison and are allowed to stay to join Rick's group. For a time, there is actual peace at the prison, and Glenn proposes to Maggie. Meanwhile, Andrea and Michonne discover the heavily fortified town of Woodbury, led by a man known as the Governor. Michonne is highly suspicious of this leader, but Andrea is quickly won over by his charm. Also living in Woodbury is Merle, who survived being handcuffed during a walker attack by cutting off his own hand. While Michonne begins to investigate the Governor, she discovers that Merle has been tasked with bringing walkers into the town alive for a resident named Milton to experiment on. Other walkers are used for public gladiator fights as entertainment for the Woodbury residents. Disgusted by what she uncovers, Michonne decides to leave Woodbury, though Andrea chooses to stay behind. While searching for a new home, Michonne witnesses Merle capture Glenn and Maggie, who were out looking for baby supplies. Michonne then finds the prison and alerts Rick about Maggie and Glenn's capture. Rick and Daryl accompany Michonne to Woodbury, where they save Glenn and Maggie. While there, Michonne fights the Governor and stabs him in the eye. As the group escapes, Daryl is shocked to discover that his brother was still alive, and Merle decides to leave Woodbury with them. The Governor then decides to declare all-out war against Rick's group at the prison. As Andrea foolhardily tries to make peace between the two groups, both sides prepare for battle. Rick, Carl, and Michonne travel to Rick's hometown to stock up on weapons, where they run into Morgan. In the time that Rick last saw him, Dwayne has died and Morgan has become unhinged by his grief. Rick tries to convince Morgan to join them, but he refuses. When Andrea realizes that peace isn't an option and that the Governor plans on killing everyone in the prison, Andrea attempts to flee Woodbury to warn her former allies. The Governor captures Andrea and locks her in a room with Milton, who he fatally stabs, making it only a matter of time before he reanimates as a walker. Meanwhile, Rick reluctantly comes to the conclusion that they could give Michonne to the Governor to avoid any further violence, and tasks Merle with delivering her to Woodbury. Merle, having seen the positive change the group has had on Daryl, has a change of heart and allows Michonne to escape. Instead, Merle sacrifices himself to lead a walker horde against the Governor's men, which kills many of them. As the season comes to a close, the Governor and his army attack the prison. Rick's group fights back and defeats their enemies, forcing the Governor and the remnants of his army to flee. When the surviving members of the Woodbury army refuse to continue the fight, the unhinged Governor murders them all. Having defeated the Governor, Rick and his allies head to Woodbury, where they discover that Andrea had been bitten by Milton. She gives a tearful goodbye to her old friends before killing herself to avoid turning into a walker. In Season 4 of The Walking Dead, the survivors in the prison, now including the remnants of Woodbury, have been living peacefully for many months. When a fatal flu begins spreading throughout the survivors, Carol murders some of the sick and burns their bodies to stop the illness from spreading further. Carol has grown more strong-willed and pragmatic since the deaths of her husband and daughter, but despite Rick understanding her thinking, he is still forced to banish her from the prison. Meanwhile, the defeated governor meets the Chambler family, Tara, Lily, and Lily's daughter Megan. The governor hides his past from the family and develops a relationship with Lily. When the governor runs into his old right-hand man Martinez, he discovers that Martinez has gathered his own devoted army and arsenal. The governor then kills Martinez and leads his new army toward the prison, in the hopes of taking it over to secure a safe home for the Chamblers. Outside the prison, the governor captures Michonne and Herschel, threatening their lives if Rick doesn't abandon the prison. When Rick instead offers coexistence, the governor executes Herschel and orders his army to storm the prison gates. An all-out war breaks out between Rick and the governor's armies, and walkers begin pouring into the prison. In the chaos, Megan is bitten by a walker, and the governor is forced to put her down. As Rick and the governor enter a brawl, Michonne stabs the governor, fatally wounding him. Lily, distraught over the pain the governor has inflicted upon her family, executes him before she is devoured by walkers. The survivors from the prison are all forced to abandon their home and are separated from each other. The disparate group all begins seeing signs leading to a supposed sanctuary known as Terminus. Along their separate journeys to Terminus, Carol is forced to murder a young girl who murders her own sister in the hopes of turning her into a zombie, Beth is kidnapped by mysterious strangers, and Glenn travels with Tara Chambers before running into former soldier Abraham Ford and his girlfriend Rosita Espinosa, who were escorting scientist Eugene Porter to Washington, D.C. to deliver a supposed cure to the Walker outbreak. As the season comes to a close, Rick, Carl, Michonne, and Daryl reach Terminus, where they are warmly greeted by its leader Gareth and asked to give up their weapons. Rick quickly realizes that something was off about Terminus before they are held at gunpoint and locked inside a train car, where they discover that all of their other allies, except for Carol and Tyrese, had also been captured. But Rick wasn't worried about his group's latest predicament, as Terminus had just messed with the wrong people. In Season 5 of The Walking Dead, Carol and Tyrese help save their friends from Terminus, who it turns out were cannibals. During their escape, Rick's group is joined by Father Gabriel, who is currently experiencing a crisis of faith after locking his congregation out of his church, leading to them all being eaten by walkers. Eventually, Rick confronts and kills Terminus leader Gareth. Abraham, Rosita, Glenn, Maggie, and Tara decide to continue escorting Eugene to Washington, D.C., while Rick and the others stay behind to search for the kidnapped Beth. On their journey to DC, Eugene confesses to the group that he lied about being a scientist and knowing the cure in order to convince stronger people to protect him. Rick's group discovers that Beth has been kidnapped by a group of survivors who have taken over an abandoned hospital. Rick captures members of the hospital group to trade for Beth, but during the exchange, Beth stabs the hospital's leader, Dawn. Dawn instinctively shoots Beth dead, prompting Daryl to kill Dawn. Rick's group leaves the hospital devastated. Despite Eugene's lie being exposed, the group decide to continue on their trek to DC. Along the way, tension and fatigue grows as they slowly run out of food and water. When Tyrese is bitten by a walker and dies, the group's spirits are further dampened. Eventually, the group are approached by a stranger named Aaron, who delivers them food and water and explains he is from a walled-off safe zone known as Alexandria. His community had food, water, and even houses with electricity and running water. Despite Rick's fears that Alexandria would be another Woodbury or Terminus, the group hesitantly goes with Aaron. In Alexandria, the group meets the community's leader, Deanna Monroe, and are forced to turn over all their weapons. Despite Rick's suspicions, Alexandria is exactly as Aaron promised. The community was so safe and secure, in fact, that most of its residents were completely unaware and unskilled in dealing with walkers. The members of Rick's group begin to settle in nicely to their new home, including Carl, who begins dating teenage Alexandria resident Enid. Unfortunately, Rick continues to feel paranoid, and discusses with the similarly skeptical Daryl and Carol ways that they could take over Alexandria should things go awry. Meanwhile, Daryl begins accompanying Aaron on his scouting missions, and the two run into Morgan, who has been following a map left to him by Rick to reunite with his old friend. When Rick discovers that the town surgeon Pete is abusing his wife Jessie and sons Ron and Sam, Rick goes to Deanna to take action. Deanna is reluctant to punish Pete as his skills as a surgeon were incredibly valuable. Rick takes matters into his own hands, confronting Pete and getting into a very public fight. Deanna orders Rick to stand down, but he instead draws his gun and points it at the crowd of Alexandrians, ranting that they were too weak and complacent to survive. Realizing that Rick had become an antagonist that threatened all of his allies' place in Alexandria, Michonne is forced to knock him out. As a council determines whether or not Rick should be exiled from Alexandria, an angry and drunken Pete confronts Rick with Michonne's katana. Deanna's husband Reg attempts to calm Pete down, but in the process, Pete accidentally kills him. Distraught over Reg's death, Deanna finally gives Rick permission to execute Pete, just as Daryl and Aaron arrive with Morgan. In Season 6 of The Walking Dead, a now Zen-like Morgan helps his old friend Rick realize that his hardened survival skills needed to be softened now that they were living in a peaceful community. As Rick readjusts to a semi-normal life, he develops a romantic relationship with Jessie. Meanwhile, Maggie discovers that she is pregnant with Glenn's baby. Unfortunately, trouble was lurking outside the walls of Alexandria. First, a villainous group of survivors named the Wolves attack, which Carol leads the charge in fighting off. Then a massive herd of walkers approaches. Despite their best efforts to divert the herd, Alexandria's walls quickly become surrounded by walkers who manage to breach the community's defenses. As the walkers invade Alexandria, the citizens inside are quickly overwhelmed with no chance of fighting back. After being bitten by a walker, Deanna sacrifices herself to buy time for the others to escape. Rick covers his group in the blood and guts of a walker to help them blend in and move through the other walkers undetected. Walking hand in hand through the walker herd, the young Sam begins to freak out, attracting the walkers to him. As he is devoured by walkers, his mother Jessie refuses to leave him behind and is also swarmed by the undead. Jessie's death grip on Carl forces Rick to chop off the arm of his new lover to save his son. In response, Jessie's surviving son Ron holds Rick at gunpoint. Michonne kills Ron, but in the process, Ron's gun goes off, shooting Carl in the eye. Rick manages to give an inspiring speech to rally the surviving Alexandrians, while Daryl leads a team to draw the walkers' attention. And with that, the Alexandrians are able to fight through the night and kill every single walker. 2 months later, Rick has assumed leadership of Alexandria and begun a romance with Michonne, who takes on a motherly role toward Carl and Judith. Rick and Daryl then meet Jesus, who introduces them to another community known as the Hilltop, led by the squirrely Gregory. Jesus explains that a man named Negan was the leader of a villainous group known as the Saviors, who extorted supplies from the Hilltop under threat of an attack. Daryl has a run-in with escaped Saviors Dwight and Sherry, who steal his motorcycle and crossbow. To help bolster the supplies lost during the Walker attack, Maggie makes a deal with Gregory to kill Negan and stop the Saviors in exchange for half of the Hilltop supplies. Rick's group begins hunting down Saviors and slaughtering them at their various compounds. While out on a run, Maggie begins experiencing pregnancy pains and the group attempt to rush her to the Hilltop for medical attention. On their way, the group discovers that all routes have been blocked by the Saviors, forcing Rick's group into a Savior trap. As the Saviors capture everyone and hold them at gunpoint, Negan finally reveals himself. Wielding a barbed wire covered baseball bat he nicknamed Lucille, Negan explains that someone from Rick's group needed to die as revenge for the slaughter of countless Saviors. In Season 7 of The Walking Dead, Negan exacts his revenge by brutally beating Abraham and Glenn to death. Negan explains that Alexandria worked for the Saviors now, and to ensure their further cooperation, he takes Daryl hostage back to the Saviors' home, known as the Sanctuary. While imprisoned, Daryl learns more about the inner workings of the Saviors, where the non-soldiers were forced to perform labor to earn supplies or comfort. Negan also takes many wives, often by force. Daryl also discovers that Dwight and Sherry had returned to the sanctuary, with Sherry being forced into becoming one of Negan's wives and Dwight having half of his face burned as punishment for his escape attempt. In the time since Daryl last saw Dwight, he had earned Negan's trust and become one of his top lieutenants, alongside another man named Simon. Eventually, Sherry helps Daryl escape before leaving to follow her own path. On his first visit to Alexandria, Negan confiscates all of their weapons and most of their medicine. Rick accepts defeat and encourages his community to obey the Savior's orders. Many in the community reject this notion, including Rosita, who begins a relationship with Deanna's son Spencer, and tasks Eugene with creating live ammunition. When Negan returns and kills Spencer, Rosita uses a bullet crafted by Eugene and a smuggled gun to shoot at Negan, but instead strikes Lucille. In retaliation, Negan